So hello everyone, and welcome back. Um, so um, so okay, sorry. The research and results I'm presenting here are part of the first phase of ABIDE that Verónica introduced in the morning, and it focuses on the institutional and the normative frameworks. Before presenting our analysis and the results, it is worth briefly mentioning that it was not so long ago that non-human animals became visible in Western disaster governance and policy frameworks and agendas. The most significant turning point was Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, United States in 2005. And it gave rise to the enactment of the first public policy to include provisions of for animal protection. It's called the PETS Act, which stands for Pets Evacuation and Transportation Standards of 2006. As several authors have argued, the current Western disaster governance framework is highly anthropocentric. It has historically rested on the nature-culture hazard vulnerability dualism, where disasters occur when the two meet. These frameworks have also prioritized certain humans' lives over animals' lives, and also certain animals, like companion animals. When animals are addressed in disaster policies, this is mostly because of the goods and services they provide humans rather than for their intrinsic value or right. They appear, for example, as environmental impacts of disasters, as property losses, or as risk factors to human safety during emergencies. They are also not recognized in most official definitions of disaster, like this one from the UN Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015-2030. Sorry. This is relevant because, as Gaillard argues, who speaks on whose behalf and who writes and ultimately defines what a disaster is contribute to outlining specific discourses where knowledge, representation, and reality conflate. Public policies are a key site to understand such discursive practices. They reflect and reify particular values, understandings of human-nature relationships and representations of non-human animals. And they have also important material consequences as they convey and prescribe notions of what is and what is not worthy of protection. And in this sense, policies simultaneously include and exclude, render visible and invisible. So our aim was to explore whether animals are visible or not in formal disaster wildfire policy discourses in the three countries, Australia, Brazil, and Portugal, and how animals are represented. In particular, we analyzed to what extent, when, and where animals are visible, if some species are more visible than others, and why, and when animals are visible, what kind of visibility they get. Veronica mentioned briefly this in the morning, so I won't go into too much detail, but it's just to mention that we drew upon analyses of policy documents enacted by the legislative bodies and also the public institutions at a national federal scale. So here we didn't consider the state and local scale of Australia and Brazil. Most of these documents were retrieved in public online legal databases and official websites of public entities, and we search for wildfires or disasters and animal terms. So here, unlike media, we only have the documents that mention animals and wildfires or disasters together. Verónica already mentioned the types of documents, so the laws, initiatives, and parliamentary initiatives like bills, motions, also the parliamentary debates, and here we use the speech as our entry, national plans, and other documents. Time frame is spent from 2017 to December 2023 in Brazil and Portugal, and then 2019 to December 2023 in Australia. And we consider the wildfires of 2017 and 2019 as our temporal reference points because they marked a turning point, as also Verónica mentioned, in terms of not only of the magnitude of wildfires, but also because of the high numbers of animal casualties, including threatened species and habitat destruction. Just very briefly, in Portugal, 2017 was the most catastrophic year on historical record, with over 500,000 hectares burned, 116 human casualties and hundreds injured. This was mostly due to two major wildfire events in mid-June and mid-October that affected mostly the center and northern regions. In terms of animal victims, we only found the numbers of livestock. In June, there were a few dozen, and in October, over 500,000, that including sheep, goats, pigs, cattle, and poultry. In Brazil, 2017 also marked a record, this time of number of fires. Over 60 million hectares burned, including a great extension of the Amazon and the Cerrado. And Cerrado is a study area of our project in Brazil. It was also the biome with the most conservation units affected. Over a quarter of an iconic national park, an UNESCO World Heritage Site that is called Chapada dos Veadeiros, burned. The number of animal victims is not known. In Australia, the 2019-2020 bushfire season, that is known as Black Summer, was one of unprecedented scale and intensity. It affected every state and territory, but it was particularly violent in eastern Australia. Over 24 million hectares burned, 33 people died, nearly 3 billion native vertebrates died, and tens of thousands of livestock. Here is mostly sheep and cattle. In total, our search yielded 700 documents. Half of these are from Australia. The remaining half is divided between Brazil and Portugal. Also, Verónica mentioned that each document was included as an entry in the database that we showed in the morning and categorized according to several variables. We resorted to a mixed methodology using quantitative and qualitative content analysis and considered the three countries together. So our first question, we explored when and where animals are most visible in terms of wildfire seasons and also disaster phases and the types of policy documents. Most documents were published in 2020. In Australia and Brazil, there are over 65% of references to animals and wildfires in this year. There are mostly due to two high-profile wildfire events, the Australian Black Summer that I just mentioned, and also the wildfires in Brazilian Pantanal, which caused the death of around 17 million vertebrates. In Portugal, there is no clear peak in terms of publication year, although 2017 stands out. Regarding the main disaster phases, we followed the dominant disaster risk management cycle in Western frameworks, that is mitigation, preparedness, response and recovery. Half of the documents address the response phase, followed by recovery, and there are few references to mitigation and preparedness. This means that animals are more visible during and after wildfires, when their death and suffering become a spectacle and also politicized, and not in the phases of mitigation and preparedness, which are crucial for addressing the root causes of vulnerabilities to wildfires. There are also some interesting differences at a country level here in this graph. Australia has the least documents on mitigation and preparedness. In Brazil, the response phase is dominant with no documents on preparedness, and Portugal seems to be an exception. Preparedness comes first, followed by recovery, and this likely reflects some shifts in wildfire governance after the 2017 wildfires, more towards prevention. The type of policy documents mentioning animals is also relevant because they have different legal and also material effects. So parliamentary initiatives and debates are predominant overall, which means that most discourses have not yet materialized in enforceable legal instruments. Portugal, again, seems to be an exception with the highest number of legislation. Although these results should be read with caution because, for example, Australia and Brazil, these low levels of legislation might be more due to jurisdictional differences between federal and state laws. Regardless of the type of document, animals are not a central focus in over half of the documents that we analyzed. Rather, they are briefly mentioned in documents that are primarily concerned with other issues like institutional responsibilities, challenges during and after animal rescue, or economic impacts. In over a quarter of the remaining documents, they have moderate centrality, which means that they are important but not the focus, and only in 17% they are the main focus. In these cases, it's mostly the parliamentary initiatives, and they pertain to three topics: wildlife and habitat protection, animal emergency management, and game species protection in Portugal only. However, none of these recognizes animals' political agency. Besides where and when, we also looked at animals themselves. In this case, the types, the classes, and the species mentioned. We identified 6 broad categories of animals: companion animals, livestock or farm animals, wildlife, game species, only in Portugal, sport and recreation animals, and unspecified references with terms like animals, fauna, biodiversity. And considering the 3 countries together, wildlife is the predominant type, followed by livestock and these unspecified terms. But there are important differences between the countries that are worth exploring. In both Australia and Brazil, wildlife is predominant, and these countries are globally recognized biodiversity hotspots. Livestock is dominant in Portuguese policy discourses. They're followed by companion animals that is mostly due to wildfire events in 2020 and 2021 that hit illegal shelters. Also, some animal species or even whole taxa are more visible than others. Most of the species mentioned are vertebrates and mammals, illustrating a taxonomic bias in policy discourses. One interesting exception, is the insect class, that is represented almost exclusively by honeybees, especially in Portugal. In terms of genre or species terms, we identified 187 terms that rank from very generalist terms like aquatic animals and folk taxonomies like bats, to specific family and to specific species. And then for analysis purposes, we group them into 61 categories corresponding to specific animals or groups of animals. In these three circles, they include the terms with over 15% of references. And in Australia, koala stands out, followed by feral animals and native species. In Brazil is the jaguar, and the others are only in 15%. In Portugal, as I mentioned, livestock is dominant, and here is the honeybee. Honeybees and goats and sheep are dominant. So the most visible animal seems to be the charismatic, the threatened, and native vertebrates, or those that threat them, feral animals, and also livestock. But this, as we will see, this visibility often reinforces symbolic, instrumental, and anthropocentric logics that materialize in actions of care and violence with important consequences for individual species, organisms, and ecologies more broadly. So koalas in Australia and jaguars in Brazil. They are charismatic, iconic, and flagship species. Nationally, koalas are classified as endangered and the jaguar as vulnerable. This one is osado that Verónica mentioned in the morning. Each of these species symbolizes either their country, like the koalas, or specific biomes like Pantanal in the case of jaguars. And koalas, for example, are described in the documents as a national treasure, as our national symbol. These species have also become emblematic of the wildfires and their impacts, and they are enmeshed in political and media narratives about these events. Also, and Verónica mentioned this already, the only individually named animals in all documents belong to these species. There are two koalas, Louis and Kevin, and there is osado. And this is relevant because, as Steve argues, whereas an individual animal can be seen and empathized with, a species remains an abstract entity devoid of direct relationships. Their visibility has prompted modes of care with cascading effects on other species. Some examples. In the case of the koala, an MP from the Australian Greens mentioned how saving koalas and their habitat means saving other wildlife, and how the images of our helpless koalas circulated around the world and prompted donations to charities and funds set up to save the koala and other precious native species, and showing just how important the koala is to us all. In the case of jaguar, onça or onça pintada in Portuguese, in this statement, a veterinary involved in wildlife rescue talks about the jaguar effect and the positive cascading effects that the mediatic case of osado had on rescue. He explains how rescue was extremely difficult in the beginning. He says, we would carry out a rescue and then had to find a destination for the animal. They could travel 7, 8, 9 hours, but then with osado things changed. After that, we began receiving more support, including improved transportation logistics. And he says that it's great that this happened, but it could have happened from the beginning. Today we can act much more efficiently, but that only came after the jaguar effect. And also another interesting thing is that policy discourses also highlight the jaguar's ecological role at the top of the food chain, and also seem to have shifted their framing, because jaguars are often viewed negatively, especially due to livestock depredation. But in these documents, they appear as victims rather than predators. Unlike Australia and Brazil, livestock is dominant in Portugal, mostly linked to discourses around governmental support after the wildfires for farmers and beekeepers. For the rural communities that are most affected by wildfires in Portugal, they are mostly located in marginal, depopulated areas. Small subsistence farming remains relevant and was very affected. And finally, what kind of visibilities do animals get when they become visible? So our quantitative analysis enabled the identification of 3 clusters, 3 discursive topologies in which the visibility of animals is defined and can either empower, marginalize, or erase them. They correspond to 3 types of policy discourses that we term emotional, ecological instrumental, or guardianship. These are, of course, simplifications and can, in times, overlap. Briefly about emotional discourse. This is the predominant type of discourse. Here, 2 interrelated topics prevail: the themes of animal death and the immediate consequences of wildfires, and it pertains to the response phase. This type of discourse appears mostly in parliamentary debates, which means that they have not yet materialized in concrete policies. In a retrospective view of what happened during and immediately after wildfires, the animals become part of an effective atmosphere of catastrophe. So this type of discourse has a strong emotional dimension that is associated with loss, with grief, with sadness. They are framed as fatal victims of wildfires, but their centrality is low. They are mostly mentioned in passing as just another victim, another consequence, amongst many others. And so their visibility is largely symbolic in the composition of a post-apocalyptic scenario. So here in some of these passages, animals are often referred through mass nouns, some generalist terms like animals, wildlife, biodiversity, livestock, and are written into numbers that are used to tell a tragic story. So, for example, more than 1 billion animals, thousands of dead animals, lost biodiversity. So in doing so, the impacts on individual species or organisms are erased. This dimension is also political, as grief seems to be selective. Many species were affected, but only certain lives are publicly mourned, mostly threatened and charismatic species, but also livestock. Also, as this last passage exemplifies, grief for the other than human is also not always consensual. In Portugal, for example, some MPs from the Socialist Party defended that only humans are grievable and bearers of a special dignity, and they voted against a motion that included mourning the loss of animals and forests. Unlike the first, the ecological instrumental discourse is forward-looking and has more heterogeneous topics and framings of animals. It pertains to the recovery phase and to governmental responses, or the lack, in relation to 2 powerful biopolitical regimes, wildlife conservation and agriculture. The centrality of animals is also low. What seems to be central is the intervention itself. This type of discourse is predominant in policy instruments that are already in place, like legislation and national plans, or in parliamentary initiatives, namely bills and parliamentary committees. Here, rather than symbolic, animals' visibility is materialized in concrete instruments with important consequences, but this can also render animals invisible in different ways through being represented according to anthropocentric, utilitarian, and neoliberal logics of care, control, and capital. This discourse can be divided into two subtypes, one pertaining to conservation biopolitics and another pertaining to agriculture biopolitics. Starting with conservation, documents mentioned, for example, medical treatment or rehabilitation of wild animals that were injured or orphaned, or the protection of surviving wild animals through, for example, food provision, habitat recovery, hunting bans, or more legal protection. There are also monetary policy instruments. For example, in Australia, there was the National Bushfire Recovery Fund and the Wildlife and Habitat Bushfire Recovery Program. There are often critiques from the opposition to governmental inaction or inadequate environmental policies. In Australia, for example, several documents highlight the paradoxical concern for koalas and their protection after the wildfires, while the governmental policy still allows extractive and logging practices that destroy their habitat. While policy regimes value threatened and native species, they frame other animals as threats to be eliminated through lethal methods or excluded. Here the justification for their killability is the protection of native and valued species and habitats, and this is particularly evident in the case of Australia, that are in documents that are focused on animals that are deemed invasive or feral, that benefit from post-fire conditions like large herbivores and predators like foxes and feral cats. And feral cats, for instance, are described in this quote as incredible and amazing predators that take advantage of things like fires to have a greater impact on the native species, which are more at risk from predation. They are managed through trapping, exclusion fences, or eradication programs. Other programs like this one entailed the removal of feral horses from a national park, or aerial culling of feral herbivores and foxes. In other disaster phases, like mitigation, herbivores are valued for their cheap labor and are rendered visible as service providers because of the management of the fuel loads through their grazing and their trampling. Within specific timeframes and locations, animals can become allies. In Portugal, for instance, an ordinance regulated a payment of a subsidy for extensive grazing that is described here as an ecosystem service that allows maintaining fuel load levels, that reduces the maintenance costs of the firebreak networks. And in Brazil and Australia, the use of grazing cattle is more controversial. In Brazil, Verónica already mentioned the case of the boi bombeiro firefighting ox, that is here described as a way to reduce the excessive organic matter. And this commodified logic is clearer in relation to agriculture biopolitics. And in this case, the victims are the farmers and the beekeepers and not animals. Domestic animals are framed in economic terms as productive assets, as lost properties. In all three countries, policy instruments after the fire included monetary assistance to the affected farmers or beekeepers, restocking animals or providing food for the animals that survived. Here, animals are rendered as life commodities and properties that can be substituted or compensated for, which also invisibilizes the complex relationships between individual animals and their owners that often go beyond economic logics. And in the case of honeybees, there are also references not only to their economic value, but also ecological, in the case of pollination action and services that are mentioned in these quotes, and their importance for how we live and what we eat. So they are valued mostly for human survival. Finally, this last type of discourse is the least prevalent one. It revolves around animal emergency management, and here animals are predominantly companion and domestic. They are legally considered properties. This discourse departs from what happened to animals in former wildfires, like the high mortality numbers or some difficulties pertaining to animal rescue, to prepare and avoid similar catastrophes from happening. Integrating animals into disaster management is often framed as a way to protect not only the animal but also those responsible for them. In Portugal, for example, the current wildfire management plan includes the safety and security of people, animals, and property as one of its objectives, and considers animals, mostly companion ones, as part of the evacuation planning. And the previous plan was silent about animals. And in Brazil, a bill was recently approved, according to which federal, state, and municipal governments are responsible for rescuing animals in disasters. This type of discourse figures mostly in legislative instruments, which means that the visibility is materialized in instruments that render them subjects of care, although this does not necessarily mean they are implemented or enforced. An interesting aspect is that bills about this topic are authored by various political parties from the opposition across the political spectrum, so from the radical left to the far right, which demonstrates the transversality of this topic. The centrality of animals tends to be medium, unlike the other two types of discourses. And this is the only discourse where animals appear as at the core of political practices, although it still follows the logic of human sovereignty, where animals are to be saved by humans and also for humans to be saved. One of the central focus of this discourse pertains to animal rescue and evacuation planning. In Australia, the government established a royal commission after the 2019-2020 wildfires, and in its report, it includes specific recommendations around this topic. It acknowledged that animals, both domestic pets and livestock, were often part of the evacuation process, but not all evacuation centers were able to accommodate animals, and some people did not use these facilities because they didn't want to leave their animals elsewhere. In Portugal and Brazil, several bills were presented and discussed about including animal protection and rescue within emergency plans. And despite a medium centrality, animals' visibility can gloss over other important aspects, such as structural conditions underlying the vulnerability to disasters. And there is an interesting exception in Portugal. There was a bill about regulating companion animals chaining, mentioning that floods and wildfires are particularly fatal for chained animals with no chance of escaping or seeking refuge. So, to sum up, disasters might occasion opportunities for policy change and bring attention to the animals affected, but but post-disaster policy landscapes seem to remain largely human-centric. And given the number of documents that we gather, 700, it may seem that animals are visible in wildfire policy discourses in the 3 countries, but this visibility is complex, it is contextual, it is not always synonym with being visibilized as political subject or protected or ethically considered, nor is it inherently positive. One interesting aspect is the predominance of wildlife in Australia and Brazil and livestock in Portugal, which is at odds with existing literatures on animals in disaster policies and governance that have tended to focus more on companion species, mostly in the US. And again, as I already mentioned, that animals are more visible during and after wildfires, but not in the prevention phase, where the structural and entangled vulnerabilities of both humans and non-humans can be addressed. There is a selective politics when it comes to animals' visibility, their grievability, and even killability that relates to, for example, their legal status, their charisma, their endangered status, political, economic assemblages, biopolitical regimes. Charismatic species like koalas or jaguars may be hyper-visible, others remain invisible like invertebrates, or are ungrievable and killable like feral species. And these selective politics materialize in actions of care and violence that are important for individual species and ecologies. The 3 dominant discursive regimes that we identified seem to be filtered in a way or another through mostly anthropocentric, instrumental, and sovereignty logics that erased animals' own experience and render them as passive in decision-making. While we focused on animals, this is not intended to replicate a nature-culture division. On the contrary, disaster governance should not be either an either human or animal issue, but relational and natural cultural. This means paying attention to the entangled interspecies relationalities across all phases and the shared vulnerabilities. To grapple with environmental crisis, policy frameworks should be more inclusive and responsive to both humans and non-humans as active agents, and this is what we propose to do in the final stage of ABIDE. And in this quote, taking an anthropocentric approach to disaster is not important simply because it could be considered more ethical, but because disasters themselves are demonstrably not human-centric. Thank you.
So we'll just move on to the next presentation about the media narratives, which Sarah and myself will be presenting. So I'll start by resuming a little bit what we were discussing before lunch, which is this is the second part, or anyway, one of the parts of this focus we have in how mainstream narratives are portraying animals in disasters, and here in particular we're focusing in traditional media. So just to go back a little bit to that, the 4 phases of the ABIDE project, this is about the first phase, exploring the narratives of disasters, and now I'll pass it on to Sarah. Is it? Or is it this part? Ah, okay, I move on in this one still. Okay, so it's still my part. Okay, so in this describing a little bit our goal here is to identify how public opinion is shaping the narrative, and is also shaped by concomitant narratives about wildfires, disasters, and animals therein, and how they include non-human participants, in particular animals. And this includes 3 specific phases: the preparedness, the emergency, and recovery. So it's worth telling a little bit the story of how we started. So we start with the Portuguese case in particular the year of 2017, which we find is a cornerstone, like a milestone in how disaster governance developed in Portugal. And so we took that year as a baseline year, and we developed the methodology to analyze the media focusing on that particular year. And then that methodology and the data we collected and the results we analyzed for 2017 serve us as a baseline to extend to other years, 2022, 23, and 24. And why 22? Because we follow the fire, as I was explaining previously, and this is the year where the big fire struck in one of our natural parks in the north, more or less when the project began, so it was one of our selected research areas. So we are starting with the years that we find are turning points in how the media portray animals, and then we adapted this methodology both to the policies and to the media, and the outputs, we'd already discussed this in the morning, but just to remember for those who weren't here, two databases of media and policies, in this case of media, and a set of macro and micro categories that can be further extended and applied.
So to start off with the Portuguese case, can you hear me? Okay. We introduced you the information sources and the time frame for collection. For 2017, the time range was directed at the moment of the two specific wildfires, covering the day of start of the fires and the next month and a half, like we were talking earlier. From 2022 to 2024, we collected all the news related to the wildfires during the Portuguese fire season, which starts in July and ends in September, but we started on June 15th and October 15th to cover all this time, during and after the disasters. For the sources, we chose 3 national coverage newspapers and 2 national TV broadcasts. The first one was Público, then Correio da Manhã e Expresso, and for the national TV broadcasts, RTP1 and TVI. RTP1 is a public channel, TVI is a private channel, like we are also talking about earlier. So the retrieve of this information was done manually by going from each newspaper and broadcasting during that period and searched for the information we were collecting. We used some general keywords like wildfires or disasters, and to identify animals, we looked for more specific words like animals, cows, dogs, biodiversity, etc. The retrieve, from the years of analysis, we collected a total of 6,527 news about wildfires, of which 683 mentioned animals. So it gives a 10.5 of prevalence of the news during all the years of the analysis, and it's possible to see the evolution here in the chart, where the news of 2017 had the lowest percentage of mentioned animals, followed by the news of 2022, which had the highest number of mentions, and then in 2023 the value is lower, and in 2024 it rises slightly again. In summary, we identified that only a small percentage of news concerned animals, and it indicated the lack of visibility that is given to the non-humans in the mainstream media. Thank you. To give some context about the wildfires in 2017, there were 2 big ones. So one in mid-June in Pedrógão Grande, and the other in mid-October in north and center of Portugal. So it was one of the most devastating wildfire seasons. During this period, over 500,000 hectares of land were burnt, and 116 human lives were lost. As for animal losses, they are only livestock numbers corresponding to more than 500,000 animals, including sheep, goats, pigs, poultry, and cattle. For the analysis, we collected 1,791 news about Pedrógão Grande, which corresponds to 24%, to 74%, of total, and 613 news concerning north and center of Portugal, which is 25%. Considering sources, the printed newspaper Correio da Manhã collected the most news about fires, which is 42% of total, and among the TV sources, TVI gave more visibility to it, with 21% of total. The least mentions were through Expresso newspaper, which we were expecting since their publishing is only weekly, while all the other sources are daily. Focusing on the news that mentions animals, it's important here to bear in mind that only 195 new species mention animals, so the analysis was made with this small number, which corresponds to 8% of total of news about wildfires. So in the first place, we analyzed the level of centrality. 53% of the news with animals had low centrality, which means that the piece only mentions briefly animals, or in the case of television, they might just appear in the background, not even be mentioned by words or texts. Then 30% were moderated, with some relevance already, and 14% were high, where they were at the center of the news pieces. In the second place, we saw the distribution by the channel and TV broadcasts and printed newspapers, and we came into conclusion that 62% of the news came from TV, while 38% corresponded to the newspapers. Thank you. We then explored key actors represented. Affected populations and citizens were the most mentioned, appearing in 62% of the pieces. On the other hand, farmers and citizens only stood out in about 12% of the cases. And finally, we looked at the types of animals mentioned. So livestock and farmed animals stood out, appearing in more than a half, 52% of the pieces, while companion animals were featured in 25%. Then, in 12% of the cases, the references involved unspecified terms, such as just the words animals. As for the specific species mentioned, we had emphasized mostly dogs, cats, sheep, chicken, honeybees, pigs, horses, pigeons, mule, cattle, rabbits, and the word just animals. To move on to the next step of the analysis, we created then a set of categories which have already been introduced to and classified the new species accordingly. In 2017, there were 10 macro categories, but we decided to exclude some of them, which were adoption, social and cultural context, and mitigation and preparation, due to the low number of news in those groups, and this left us with 187 valid cases. And now I'll pass the word on to Verónica.
Thank you, Sarah. So after the descriptive statistics, we moved on to multivariate analysis. So the thing is that we had lots of variables, many variables and many cases, and we needed to reduce and try to understand how this, all this data correlated with one another. And for that, we use this multiple correspondence analysis. And what this kind of analysis does, it measures the distances and it maximizes the distances between categories. So what underlies what this is doing is the input data for this kind of analysis are the macro categories that we've seen here, excluding the ones that Sarah mentioned because they had few cases. And so the analysis, what this analysis gives us is a distribution in the discursive social space of these themes. How these themes, when the news are speaking about the animals in fires, how they distribute themselves in the social discursive space. And we found 4 main areas, so to speak, and after that we ran another analysis to understand if we could find specific groups of news that would overlap with those discursive spaces. So we have 2 kinds of analysis overlapping here in this figure. We have spatial analysis, which produces these bulks of categories, but then we overlapped a cluster analysis, which groups the news according to the ways they talk to animals. And so we found 4 discursive spaces. We call them topoi, so different places or spaces of discourse, and 4 groups of news that overlap with these spaces. So this means that 4 groups of news that convey those kind of discourses. I'm trying to move on this. Yeah. Maybe here it's better. So one that one would expect to be most prevalent is the emergency and rescue discourse, which actually only gathers 9% of the sample. If there's another one there, maybe I'll switch. The most prevalent one, as you can see, is the victims, animals as victims, which also correlates a lot. Excuse me, I'll switch this to another one. Maybe this one works better. The victims, the animals as victims, which correlates also with emotional relationships developed with animals and victimized animals. I'll go into detail in these groups. Then a group which is also quite numerous, which talks about the fire consequences and help, provided mostly to farmers and livestock owners in the aftermath of fires, and animals as economic relationship and loss. And we'll take a look into these groups. So animals as victims or victimized animals correlates deeply with emotional relationships. So there's an emotional discourse. Animals, however, often appear as what we call vicarious victims. This means that sometimes they're the victims, but actually the discourse is not about them. It's about the humans that are in loss, either because they lost their homes, their machinery, their animals, their livestock, and even their companion animals. So even so, this is a discursive space in which the emotional ties with some animals, mostly pets, is privileged. So it comes more than in other discourses. And the focus is on the personal and on emotional sides of these human-animal relationships. And however, we find, and of course this can be discussed, and it's our interpretation, that humans are mainly the main protagonists. They are the key actors. If we're doing a narrative analysis, they would be the main characters in the story. They would be the main victims, and the animals are vicariously attesting for these humans as victims. And from this, we will derive one of our strongest arguments around these media narratives that we'll talk about later. So another interesting aspect in this topological discourse is that animals appear literally tangled to humans. Like there's we talk a lot in the field about the human-animal entanglement. Sometimes they come across as symbolic. In this case, they are very often literal. This means, for instance, that there's a very clear example about this, which is chain dogs in a chain, that we can find very much in the countryside, in the affected areas by these 2 wildfires that our sample in 2017 is addressing, and this means that that social phenomenon of keeping dogs, which is very complex in a chain, increases the vulnerability of these animals to dying and to be victimized in these wildfires. And so there's this literal tangle with the lives of humans and the social and economic conditions in which these animals and humans live. And from this we elaborate towards what we call a mystification of vulnerability, which means that this type of discourse, while talking about the victimization, and this can be sometimes, so when we talk about animals as victims, it means that we are for the animals and that we are rendering animals very visible. But sometimes what happens from our point of view is that we are mystifying, which means we are keeping hidden. We are not addressing, not we, the news pieces, of course. We are not addressing the social and economic and complex conditions that make these animals and the humans as well more vulnerable to disasters. And the example we bring is this small, as you can see, we've also brought the big page of this is the popular newspaper, Correio da Manhã, so this is a popular newspaper. And this is a very small piece of news, what we call short news. But if we zoom in to this particular piece of news, what says here is that this little dog, female dog, survived the fire by hiding inside her doghouse. And the area where she moves, it did not have vegetation because of the chain, so she was in a chain, so the chain removed all the vegetation. And what the piece of news reports is that prevented the fire to reach her house, and she survived because of this. And this is, like, from our point of view, an extreme example of this mystification of vulnerability, because being in a chain is precisely the factor that makes these animals more vulnerable in wildfires. And we've seen this also in person, being there now in Serra da Estrela, and when we speak to people in our interviews, and then when they talk to us and they report how sometimes they die because the humans don't have time to get there in time to release the chain, to unchain them. And so the narrative here is built in a way that that it seems that same factor that increases vulnerability actually is protecting the animal. Another discursive space is that of support, and this support is mostly also to the humans. So here we're talking about post-fire help to the humans affected by the wildfires, and of course to the losses that also include the animals. So this is a topos about that is very much imbued also with an emotional tone of abandonment by political authorities, a critique of those public and political authorities where the local populations complain about being abandoned, being left to themselves, not being supported enough, and addressing sometimes either the misfit or the fact that the measures that are put in place to compensate them for their losses do not reach them in time. And sometimes, and here it overlaps a little bit with the praise of civil society and NGOs, in particular during the emergency phase, and how the local communities help each other, and how much supportive non-official communities and can be. So there's a focus on the political more than on other discursive spaces, and there's also a focus on support for the animals, but here it means food. So there's a lack of food after the wildfires, and the farmers there's no pasture, and we need food for, so we're talking mostly about livestock, of course. Emergency and rescue, it's around 9%, a group of, so much smaller group than the rest of the bulk of news, and it focuses mostly on the emergency phase. As one could expect, being the emergency phase, the town is very much, now I realize that I'm hiding behind the tone is very much emotional, very intense, very, it's a tone where the topics of death, despair, devastation, grief, they're very much present. But there is a sub-narrative we find, which is the social and political landscape of poverty that cuts across much of this territory that is affected by these fires. And this includes the aging of the populations, how the small villages are populated with old people, that the younger have left, they're no longer there, or the geographical isolation sometimes, and the lack of management of the land, because the land was in some cases was left to itself, like with no management at all. So again, animals appear literally tangled to humans in terms of social vulnerability, and they're also part, as Philippa mentioned in the previous presentation, of an effective atmosphere of catastrophe. So animals are very much used in this kind of narrative to build up the tone in terms of the catastrophe and the catastrophic times. And finally, economic relationship and loss. And we apologize for the graphic image, but we discussed if we should show it or not. It's also interesting because this kind of image would not be allowed in the case of humans. We would not, the journalists would not portray human corpses, carbonized. But in the case of animals, sometimes it happens. And here, animals as economic loss, in the case of Portugal, appears mostly related to domestic animals, sheep, goats, and also honeybees, as Philippa mentioned. And this is also a kind of discourse which is connected with the critique of public authorities, namely to the absence or to slowness of response. So in this piece of news, for instance, they're talking about the risk that in this mountain in the north, called Serra da Estrela, so 5,000 dead sheep, they are anticipating that there will be downfall in terms of production of a special cheese, which is only produced there because of this special breed of sheep. So now, what happened? I pass it on to you just to say. So this what I've just presented is the baseline for the rest of the analysis that then we build up from here, and we extend it to 2022 and 2023 and.
So passing on to 2022, 2023 and 2024 cases, to give some context, first in 2022, over 110,000 hectares burned, and the largest affected area was the Serra da Estrela Natural Park, which is accounted with 25% of the total of burnt area. As for animal losses, the numbers remain unknown until today. So also in 2023, over 34,000 hectares burned, and the animal losses also remain unknown. In 2024, over 136,000 hectares burned, including Madeira Islands, which counted with more than 5,000 hectares of burnt area. And in terms of animals losses, there is no official information about it either. Looking into the descriptive analysis, we collected a total of 4,118 news for these 3 years. In 2022, we collected 1,837 news. So in 2023, it was a softer year, let's say like this, which had a total of 972 new species. And finally, in 2024, there were 1,309 new species, including the fire in Madeira Island and the north and center of Portugal, like it burned also in 2017. There were some common areas. Across the 3 years, most of the new species were published by Correio da Manhã, including counting with 31% of total, followed closely by TV with 30%. RTP also had a significant share with 26%, then Público with 11% and Expresso with 3%. When it comes to the news involving animals, we collected 232 articles in 2022, 103 in 2023, and 153 in 2024, showing that references to animals remained relatively low during these years. In terms of centrality, in 2022, 57% of news showed low centrality, 16% moderate, and 27% high. And this was the year with the highest percentage of news with high centrality when compared to just 9% in 2023 and 2024. As for the distribution channels, there was no significant changes over the years, so the TV broadcasts had more mentions than printed newspapers. The main actors mentioned were predominantly affected populations and citizens, making more than half of the news in 2022 and 2023. In 2023, there was a noticeable increase in mentions of farmers and owners. Meanwhile, in 2022 and 2024, a significant portion fell into the others category, which includes specialists, institutions, and more abstract actors. Looking at the types of animals, it's the previous one? Okay, thank you. Looking at the types of animals, we see some shifts over the years. So in 2022, 63% of news focus on livestock and farmed animals, and 23% of companion animals. In 2023, the companion animals appear in 36% of the news, while livestock and farmed animals in 34%, which is very close. We also found that 14% of the news corresponded to unspecified terms, and in 2024, unspecified terms became the most common, accounting with 32% of the mentions, followed by livestock at 30%, and companion animals at 26%. So this suggests that animal references were more generalized this year. Regarding specific species, we highlight, besides the others that also appeared in 2017, the cows and the wild boars. For the distributed categories, out of the total of 12 macro categories, we decided to exclude 4 for further analysis. So it was adoption, fire causes, social and cultural context, and animal death. And this left us with 477 valid cases to pursue the analysis.
Following the same line of thought and applying the same methodology, we tested to see if the discursive spaces and types of discourses were the same. And we find that there are recurrent topics, so the victimization, animals as victims. Here, however, we have more livestock. We could expect, for instance, to have animals as victims, more companion animals, but it's mostly livestock. And that, if we go back to this slide, livestock in 2022 is impressive. The rate of news, the number of news, which this is related to what we were discussing, the impact on the production of specific products such as the cheese, for instance, in certain regions. And because the 2022 fires affected the national park with many endemic species, we would expect that the wildlife would be more present, but it doesn't seem to be the case. It seems that it didn't have that much change since 2027. Although there we don't have the data from 2017, I mean. There is something different if we compare with the data from 2017, which is this category of mitigation and preparation. This is probably related, and this is where reflecting on the results of the policies and the media together can be interesting as well. As Filipa was mentioning, that in Portugal, after the 2017 fires, there was a shift in governance that makes the analysis of the policies in Portugal slightly different than in the other two countries, with more things around preparedness and this part. And here we find that companion animals and livestock is mostly associated with this particular discursive space, with livestock being also the case of the sapper goats and the cattle, as Philip also mentioned, as helping in land management or grazing, and so reducing the fuel for fire. In terms of the economic relationship, is mostly about post-fire help, as we were mentioning, and livestock. So there's a continuity in this data, and emergency and rescue that covers both companion animals and livestock. I will highlight also something that I also wanted to highlight in the first analysis of the 2017 data, which is what we find to be an homogeneity, quite homogeneous, the data in terms of the different media. So we have here the different media, the three newspapers and the two television broadcasters, and actually they cluster here around the X, and when things cluster around the X, it means that they don't differentiate themselves one from the other. So this is interesting, and this is an interpretation to discuss, however, of course. This is interesting because one might say that, for instance, popular newspapers such as Correio da Manhã could give a more dramatic, could dramatize, hypothetically dramatize more the news, but actually we don't find that difference we don't find much difference between the way reference newspapers and popular newspapers talk about the animals and fires, and when we go to televisions, being primetime television, we have the public broadcaster, which could hypothesize could be a more serious communication, in sense like resorting less to very dramatic ways of telling the story. We don't find that difference either. It's a very homogeneous way of talking about animals in fires. And now we move on to the Brazilian case.
And to give some context for about the years of 2019 and 2020, in 2019 the Amazonian rainforest experienced a devastating fire with over 900,000 hectares burned. The exact animal losses from this event remain unknown, and then in 2020 the Pantanal wetland was severely affected, with 31% of its area burned, and in terms of animal losses there are estimated to be around 17 million vertebrates. The retrieve of news about wildfires occurred between the May 1st and November 30 for both years of analysis. In this case, we collected the information through the help of the data service Factiva, like we were talking this morning, and we were able to choose our time frame, our sources, and use generic words related to fires to make the research, such as wildfires, fires, burning, which corresponds to the word queimadas in Portuguese. The retrieve through Factiva didn't give the access to broadcasting nor news or the images, only the text, so we decided to stick with only printed versions of in terms of media sources. So we collected 3 national coverage and 1 magazine. The first, Folha de São Paulo, then o Estado de São Paulo, known as Estadão, O Globo, and Veja magazine. We collected then a total of 1,475 news articles, about wildfires, of which 262 mentioned animals, representing a prevalence of 18% across the 2 years analyzed. So this chart shows the difference between the years. So in 2019, only 10.5% of the news mentioned animals, but in 2020, the number increased to over 26%. Despite this rise, the portion remains low when compared to the total number of news collected about this topic. Out of the total of new species, 793 were from 2019 and 682 were from 2020, covering both the Amazon and Pantanal fires. Most of the pieces were published by O Globo, which accounted with 38% of the total, followed by Folha de São Paulo with 32%. Veja magazine only published articles on this topic in 2020, so its contribution was quite small. When it comes to the news that mentions animals, we collected 83 articles in 2019, and the number more than doubled in 2020, reaching 179. However, in terms of centrality, the majority of these articles in both years were classifying as having a low centrality, representing over than half of the total. In 2020, we observed, though, a more balanced distribution, kind of. 59% of the news had low centrality, 26% moderate, and 16% high. Regarding the main actors, in 2019 the most prevalent category was others, which includes the specialists or more abstract non-identified figures, affected populations and citizens had also some presence along with the federal government. In 2020, however, the federal government became the most mentioned actor, appearing in 31% of the news, followed by the others with 26%. Mentions of factors related to animal care also increased from 1 year to the next, although they still only represented in 2020 12% of the animal-related news. As for the types of animals mentioned in 2019, the focus was mainly on livestock or farmed animals, followed by wildlife and non-specific references. In 2020, this trend shifts, with the most frequent mentions were unspecified terms, followed by wildlife and then livestock. And among the species presented, we found cattle, livestock, oxen, alligators, hyacinth macaws, monkeys, armadillos, capybaras, jaguars, and then the general terms of fauna and animals. For this case, we had also 12 categories to distribute the news articles and chose to exclude the categories adoption, animal death, and social and cultural context, and it left us with 258 cases to continue the next step of the analysis that Verónica will talk about.
So before jumping on to the multivariate analysis, this is a word cloud on the most prevalent words in both samples of 2019 and 20. And well, they're not very surprising. It's mostly, but there are one or two topics that didn't, of course, come up in the Portuguese sample. Those related to desmatamento, so the deforestation in 2019, Amazon, of course, the biome in which it occurred. The government, Bolsonaro appears a lot. Bolsonaro was then the president of Brazil, very specific and controversial, and gathered much controversial from in his policies about managing not only the country but the land. And in 2020, it's mostly about Pantanal. Queimadas comes a lot. Also the president and the government. So we can already see by a simple word cloud that the topic will be much more made more political. and we won't be able to go totally inside that particular topic today. It's important to say that this data, both the Portuguese data from the most recent years, the data from Brazil, and even more data from Australia, it's still ongoing, the analysis. So we are showing our current analysis, and now we are going deeper in each one of these clusters. And also something that I may have forgotten to mention is that so what we do now afterwards, and that for 2017 that analysis is already done, then we go deeper inside each one of these clusters, each one of these groups of news and discursive spaces, and we analyze. So we go back to the qualitative in-depth analysis, and we dig into each one of these groups to understand what's inside. And so here three main groups stand out: the topic of victimization, victimized animals, the topic of emergency, and the topic of economic relationship. Then we have like residual topics with very few cases actually. Political attitudes, which is a specific topic that came up in the Brazilian sample, and the fire causes, and both of them are linked to deforestation and to the political controversial measures around using, for instance, livestock and cattle to graze and to manage the land, as it was the politics of the government in some states back then. The economic relationship one, gathering 37% of the sample, is mostly linked with agribusiness. So to this discussion about, for instance, the very polemic firefighting ox, the boi bombeiro, and so as a way of preventing the land a form of land management, so grazing the remaining fuel, and so helping forest management. This was very controversial, and these are some quotes of the pieces of news that belong to this cluster. For instance, one of them says, if we had a little more cattle in Pantanal, it would have been even less of a disaster than the one we had this year. So these are very controversial pieces of news that bring up this topic of that was very political and with very important political consequences. And this was very different from the Portuguese case, in which this typology, the economic relationship, was linked also to livestock, but mostly to raising animals for food, but mostly with domestic sheep and goats and production of cheese. And so it's a different scale and a different tone of discussion. The group in which animals appear as victims, so victimized animals, contrary to what happens in Portugal, in which these are mostly livestock and sometimes also companion animals. In these cases, because we're talking about the Amazon and Pantanal, these victimized animals are mostly endangered species. Also the lack of food, so when food is lacking, and the topic of many animal deaths of species, very charismatic species such as the jaguar. And here is some quotes. For instance, here it says that as the hyacinth macaw is a species whose diet is very restricted to basically two types of fruit, the destruction of the palm trees makes food scarce. So this entails a story of the entanglements that will put these animals at risk and makes these animals victims. But mostly it's about wildlife, protected species, exotic species, and the consequences of fire, another category that goes within this big group. It's mostly about impacts on biodiversity, while in Portugal, remember, it was about the political measures that were being put in place to compensate the farmers, for instance, or the beekeepers for their economic losses. So here there's a whole focus on wildlife and the destruction of the habitats. And finally, the emergency and rescue with 33%. It's about animal rescue. Here we're talking again, many pieces talk about these charismatic species such as the jaguar. This is probably also ousado. And the consequences of fire also correlate within this big group. And here we're talking about impacts in the landscape that will, on their part, impact on the survival of the species afterwards. So here, for instance, it says in the state park called Encontro das Águas, 85% of the area has been burned down and jaguars live there, which means they will be in danger. And the topic of animal death also comes close to this, within this big group of victimized animals. And here, for instance, we can read charred snakes and caimans are everywhere. The blue macaw refuge is threatened. Flames in the Porto Jofre, where 100 jaguars are concentrated. So this is these are the three biggest groups, and the two very residual ones are really residual, and they need a closer look to understand what's there and how they correlate with the rest. So to sum up, we would highlight three major tropes in these media narratives. Going through the analysis we've done so far, and going back, we've done Portugal for years, and Brazil, and Australia is still coming, but until now, three major tropes can be highlighted: emergency and rescue, animals as victims, and economic relationship. And some of these, as we've just seen, acquire different meanings in different contexts. So animals as victims is mostly about wildlife in Brazil, whilst in Portugal is mostly about livestock, and economic relationship have also different meanings in these two countries. Another thing we find interesting is that specific tropes associate with specific tones. For instance, economic relationship and livestock, and also companion animals, they acquire moderate centrality. Animals here in this kind of discourse, animals are not, their centrality is not so low. But when they really have centralities in the narratives of emergency and rescue, where the emotional and effective tone and relationship is more at stake and is more brought to the forefront as a way to build the narrative. Of course, we know this is kind of the core thing of building a narrative, for instance, in television, and when we're doing when we're using images, but still I think it's a result that's worthwhile highlighting. And animals as victims correlates more frequently with fire consequences, those being, for instance, the political measures put in place to compensate the farmers, or measures to tend to wildlife in danger in countries like Brazil. There are additional context-specific tropes, like mitigation and preparedness in Portugal, and we're now investigating if these are context-specific tropes that are specific and that are worthwhile exploring as very specific of these countries' mediatic narratives, or not, if it's more random association. So to sum up, I think one of our main arguments across this media narratives analysis is that we find that still, so we've been digging into the kind of visibility that animals have, if they're visible or not, and also these links with Filipa's presentations a while ago. So trying to understand if they're visible, and when they are, what kind of visibility they have. But our argument that even when they're visible, they are still absent. So we are using Carol Adams' concept of absent reference when she describes that, for instance, when we are in front of a piece of meat, the animal is there but is not there, so we are not really dealing with the animal when we're dealing with that piece of meat. And here we're not really dealing, this is our argument, dealing with the animal when we are dealing with these narratives. They are still absent reference in these mainstream narratives about disasters, because they appear as victims, but not as victims because they are conceptualized or seen as subjects with interests of their own, but mostly because they are seen as vicarious victims because someone else was a victim, like their human tutors, for instance. Someone else had losses. Even when they have losses, the losses themselves become even more central to the narrative. And so we find that they are seldom as full subjects. We mean the center of the narrative, the center of the attention. So this means that very often also they are mentioned through the lens of the vulnerability of humans, for instance, poverty. When they are depicted as heroes, which sometimes happens, like that small dog that barked until the human tutor woke up, and so the small dog, she saved the humans from being burnt in the fire. These kind of heroic narratives, we understand that they also appear as metaphors of human tragedy and as metaphors of how we can be heroes, but not so much as animals being subjects with interests and rights of their own. Also, mostly companion animals get to be heroes. It may happen that a cow or also has like this role, but then it will enter the realm of the companion species and not so much of livestock. What stays concealed from our point of view, and I think this is a topic worth discussing also with media practitioners, is that what we find is a very persistent invisibilization of the deprived conditions of animals and people prior to the fires, and their relationship with risk factors like poverty, poor living conditions, imprisonment, confinement. And we find that to discuss this, we know that news values will prioritize the emergency phase because that's what exceptional, that's part of the kind of narrative media live upon. We understand, however, that all that stays behind that lies ahead of that's what really needs going deeper into. To resume this idea that the attribution of protection to risk itself, it's something that sometimes we find also in these kind of narratives, that the very same social conditions that build vulnerability are presented as factors of protection, and that happened, of course, with that small, that of course can't be generalized, but it is an example of this kind of narrative that conceals some of the structural conditions of vulnerability to make visible the exceptional events in which something happens. So this mystification of the structural and social cultural conditions is something that from our point of view is really worth looking into. So we end up with a few prompts of how could a more than human form of journalism look like a speculative or some way, like some, I don't know, some speculation about good practices for the new forms of journalism that may include more than human agents and animals in particular. And we suggest, for instance, an increased focus on the structural factors that produce these vulnerabilities, and including, of course, the entangled vulnerabilities, as mentioned before. And these pre-exist to any disaster, and just like disasters are prepared not in the emergency phase, the narratives of disaster should be prepared not in the emergency phase if we want to address these topics. The responsible use of emotional tone and language, because emotions are what the media languages are about. So most media languages, mostly in social media and television, of course, but they build on emotions. We understand that this overcoming of this dichotomy, emotionality and being rational and being emotional, is important, and understanding how we can use emotions in a way that doesn't that doesn't hinder our capacity to still look at the structural and not stay only with the exceptional. Acknowledging constantly the entangled lives of humans and animals. As Philippe ended the previous presentation, disasters are not nor human nor animals. They don't affect either one or the other separately. They affect the entanglement. So this constant awareness of the entanglement and how how we can't really separate the lives of animals of our own and the ones affected and the others, and this acknowledgement from our point of view can help to build new forms of journalism that are more inclusive and engage in a constant reflexive practice of interrogating who will benefit from my work. And I think this of course applies to all of us and not only journalism, but here we are discussing journalistic practices. So who will benefit from the kind of pieces of news that we will produce, and training ourselves in asking continuously if the animals are there at all in my story of the events. Where are the animals? And that's it. We'll leave it here, right, Sarah? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for both of these presentations. And now I'm just wondering, does it make more sense to have the commentary on the presentation that we just heard and then return to the first one? However, if it's all fresh now from what was discussed.
Yeah, I think
whichever way.
Yeah, whichever way. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, then let's start with the policy paper, if that's okay. First of all, I want to congratulate the whole team and especially the authors of this paper and for including an immense amount of documents. 700 documents in a policy analysis is commendable, so I really respect your work, and it was a pleasure to read the entire paper. And it comes at a time when there's increased interest in multi-species governance in general, and there's increased interest and concern about finding ways to recognize animals as political subjects across our society. And the way I see it is that the work of ABIDE, and particularly this policy work that you've carried out, it does make an extremely important contribution to these ongoing debates by bringing into discussion one quite significant part of this policy ecosystem that we're looking at, and you bring in disaster governance and wildfire policy in general. And you use a term in your paper, you use the term illuminative function, and that stuck with me because I was thinking how your work really has several illuminative functions or illuminative forces insofar as the contribution it makes to various debates. So first of all, as I mentioned, to the policy ecosystem. And in addition to bringing these important debates into the discussion of what could a just multi-species policy ecosystem look like, that includes just more than human governance of disasters, but you also bring in important ideas about the discourses and narratives and whose voices, agency and knowledges and experiences are included not only in policy discussions and debates but also in media narratives. And the other illuminative function or force that I want to highlight is the educational impact that your work can have, and particularly in a field of education research, so climate change education, sustainability education, that is increasingly more attentive to the experiences of the more than human, of multi-species perspectives. And I think your work can have a huge impact on also contributing to educational discussions on climate change. So, in addition to these ideas, I wanted to pose a few questions, and these are more future-oriented questions, and feel free to not discuss these if it's too soon, but your work really made me then think about, given the ongoing discussions in general about just multi-species governance, in your analysis, and especially looking at these parliamentary debates, and your work now, your field work in the communities, have you found out
something or seen or heard something that would point to examples of good practice or examples of what would we need to take into consideration when constructing these more than human wildfire policies or more than human governance of disasters. So what would that look like? Have you found any examples in your field work and in your policy and media analysis that would point us in that direction? And you mentioned in the beginning of your presentation and your paper about the turning point that Hurricane Katrina was. And now that you've looked at these wildfires, do you see them as potentially being turning points in steering the discussion in Portugal, Brazil, and Australia in different ways of how can we move disaster governance forward into a more multi-species or more than human perspective? And that relates to, given that there were just elections in Portugal, and you mentioned in your presentation that some of the documents you looked at were parliamentary discourses that have not yet manifested into actual legal instruments. And given that, I wanted to ask whether you had plans to start engaging already with decision makers at different levels, so firefighters, politicians, or political parties in Portugal who are already having these discussions. And given the amount of work that you've already done, you have a huge toolkit and a base of knowledge to already start building those stakeholder relationships. In case you haven't already, I'm not sure, maybe you already have, but that's something, and something that was mentioned already this morning about your methodology, that publish your findings already to show the world what you're doing. And that, as I was reading the policy paper, that's something I was thinking, like the world needs to already be in dialogue and in discussion with ABIDE and with, so I think you could play a significant role in the ongoing discussions given the analysis that you've done, but also given the position that you're in. And if we think about the urgency to really make these governance transformations, you really have a situation where you could be involved in those transformations already now. And I know that was something that you had planned to do later on in the project in phase 4, but perhaps phase 4 is now. Or it's overlapping with the other phases, that it doesn't need to be linear, that they can be overlapping and have these ongoing dialogues, because I think the work that the project in general is doing is magnificent, and the world shouldn't wait until stage 4 to hear about it. So, yes. And I'm sure in my messy notes I have more questions, but I'll ask them afterwards. Do you want to comment and then, or make your comment?
Well, maybe we can say my comments for the, maybe it's easier to
Okay, yeah,
start right
maybe
away,
it's
so we don't
easier to have this
mix things up.
discussion.
Yeah.
We are going to we'll first respond to this one. But go ahead and then I can jump in if you want.
Thank you, Maria, for your comments and for reading the paper. And the feedback is, it's really great to have feedback. Those are really good questions, which means that I don't have an answer. No, but I was thinking that starting with the last one, maybe we should think that not in a linear, we've already a bit, probably not formally, because we will have the workshops later on, but we are trying to do it little by little. The Hurricane Katrina as a turning point, and whether I think if we think that hurricanes and wildfires are also very different types of disasters. And for example, the question of in Hurricane Katrina was mostly the domestic, the companion animals, and here in wildfires it's slightly different. Also, this question of the rescue and emergency is there, but there are other things to bring to the table, and maybe wildfires can be a good, and these wildfires and others there are also all over the place, unfortunately, might be a good starting point to move the conversation forward. About the good practice of multi-species governance, it doesn't come to my mind immediately, but Verónica, do you?
Yes, thank you, Philip. I was thinking the same, like examples of good practices. I think I wouldn't call them good practices, but I think it's fair to say that after 2017, there was an effort to include animals, as Philip explained, in the disaster plans and risk plans. But not all animals, but there is an effort from several stakeholders and from the political forces to include animals in the preparedness phase, and that's what I find very interesting in these results that Filipa showed. That difference from Portugal goes back to that particular. So to address your question on wildfires as a steering point. To just like Katrina, I think at least in Portugal, 2017 for sure, and we're still exploring the possibility of using that same term or frame of thinking in relation to the other two countries, which are a bit more complex because of the several layers of political documents. But here for sure there's a before and an after the 2017 wildfires in what it comes to thinking about the situation of animals. And I think that the thing I wanted to share about your last question, engaging immediately with the policy makers and the stakeholders, I think so. There's a story behind this. When I first started to work on this topic, which was with a different project, it was after 2017, and right immediately the government and the parliament they built a specific group to work on this. And I was starting a research back then, a project, and I tried to make part of that. I tried to kind of squeeze myself in, but I was not successful. So back then it didn't work. And so this time we were not doing that particular kind of approach. What we're doing, we've already interviewed several political actors, so that's already starting to ease what we're trying already to do is we're trying to weave a network of interested stakeholders that we can then afterwards sit at the table, because we understand that trust has to be built and we need to have trustful relationships with these stakeholders in order for them to even listen to us, So this is one of our approaches. We are already reaching out to them, listening to them, interviewing them individually. We have interviewed several stakeholders in the local communities we are working with. So this is a strategy trying to put them in the loop. This is what we're doing, and we'd like to work with you throughout the project. And then in the end, we'd like to come here and show you what we have. And so that's a part of what we're doing. And other thing that could seem very David. Something that may seem very simple, but from our point of view is very meaningful. Is that just by simply mentioning the topic constantly with these populations is very relevant. So whenever we go there the first time and they try to interview different policy stakeholders, their governance stakeholders, and we say we're working with animals in wildfires, and
the first time they say, oh, animals, oh, I think their animals are there. The topic doesn't exist very much for them. But the second time we go and the third time, and the topic begins to appear. So I think this may seem very simple, like just mentioning the topic one time and the other, it begins to be part of the language, of the common language, and hopefully it will make it easier for us in the last phase when we have to with the workshops. It would be wonderful to do the workshops right away, but there are two things. One is that we don't have, like, we are not ubiquitous. We can't be like in 3 places at the same time doing the ethnography, selecting the data and doing this. But the other thing is that we already have this to share about the mainstream narratives, of course, but what we really want to work with these communities is trying to build new narratives. And for that, we need the data that we are now collecting, the multi-species data, and we need to use those data and to build new stories, and then it would be amazing to bring them to help us to build those new stories. And we are speculating about the methods to work with those communities. And we're thinking, for instance, that something that is very sensorial could be very interesting. So in order for them to really feel the heat, for instance, of fire, like a wild boar feels the heat of fire while it's affected. So there are these two dimensions also. We still feel that we need to have a different kind of tool to then work with those in those workshops with the communities for impact, kind of, at least. Just one thing.
Yeah, because there are also different scales, and that's the local one, and also the national. I was thinking in the beginning we tried to reach out to all the parties that have representation in the parliament, and only one replied.
And because he was mistaken, because when he understood what the topic was about, it was like that.
Yeah.
In the interview, it was very.
So there doesn't seem to be yet openness to that, but as Veronica was saying, like maybe we can go from the local to the national, but that would be a bit tricky, the national part. But in terms of policies, in the end, they are the ones that
are doing making the policies. There is another class of stakeholders that is very relevant, which are the NGOs that are in the field. And with them, we have already some contacts with NGOs doing emergency and rescue. But there, the thing is a bit different, is that because they're very much focused on the rescue and the emergency, what they really need is a bit different. We are mostly focused on recovery, so our reflection is more about the long term, and those organizations are, of course, very much focused on the immediate and very specific, like medical care, and so we already have a network of a few stakeholders that work and this is an international level. That would be interesting also, and that's one of our goals also, to bring them to the table also to discuss this with us.
And I think your findings also point towards the significant societal value shift that would need to take place for any transformation in any kind of governance model. So if animals are devalued, instrumentalized prior to a disaster striking, then that will affect, obviously, how they are treated in those moments of disaster. So also to look what needs to shift in our relations with other animals on a societal level, the values that we share as a society, or the values that dominate our society, so that oppression and instrumentalization isn't the baseline. Because if that's the baseline, then they will be rescued only because of economic profit, or the other discourses that you've identified both in the media and the policy. So I think your findings or the discourses that you identify in policy and also in the media, they reiterate the significant problems that we face in human-animal relations or more than human relations, and the significant value transformations that need to happen for any long-term shift.
Yeah, thank you so much. Great opening of this discussion, and you connected both to the media study and the policy study. So what to add then? But I think that's, I mean, I read the paper on the 2017 fires, which I really enjoyed, and it's really, I mean, it showed the emergency of papers like this. I mean, the fact that there is so little research about discourses around these things. It was really highlighted by the paper. I also know that you got the paper accepted with minor revisions, which is a clue that this is like, this is not but it's, well, the positive reviews for an education that this kind of research is much needed for. So yeah, sorry about that. And I think like both based on the paper and your presentation, there are of course, I mean, several things that really stand out and that I think are really interesting. First, I think that you bring up all these reservations around generalization that you're supposed to do as a social scientist, like you can generalize across cases or to other cases or to other countries. But I think still, again, which is already being Maria already pointed it out, and several others have already pointed it out, that this is a very ambitious study. You have like a massive amount of material, so you really have the possibility to say something substantial here. And I mean, even if it's limited to, I mean, it's not even a limitation; it's a strength. You have 3 different cases, so that's a great basis for saying something substantial about animals in disasters. So with all the research coming during the COVID-19 crisis, the next time we have a pandemic, we know how mass media will react and how people will react on social media and how, you know, the public will respond to the crisis and so on. And no one will say that, you know, oh, that was just one pandemic, so we don't know what will happen next pandemic. So I think these are several disasters that we have already learned a lot from, just from the things we've written so far. So I was rather impressed with the continuity across cases, that that discourses are so similar, in spite of the like local specificities and I mean the differences in what animals live in these areas. There was still great continuities. I also think that the strength of the research so far is that you show, I mean, you show that there are so few articles on animals. But since you have a big number of articles, you still have a substantial mass of text to analyze with animals. So I think it's two interesting things there. You both have this rich material on animals, and by showing that it's such a small part of the disaster discourse, you also highlight the need for more attention to the situation of animals. And I think that's something in itself that maybe you want to say something more about that, your thoughts around why there's so little on animals in these news, because, I mean, mass media is often so prone to highlight animals in different ways. And I mean, like when Barack Obama got his dog, there were like pages and pages and pages about news about this dog, and then we had a disaster with animals victimized, and this should leave lots of room to write about animals, but still journalists choose not to. So that would be interesting to hear more about and your thoughts about that. I also think this emergency and rescue discourse, that theme, I think that's very interesting. Maybe you want to say something more about that. I think that's, I mean, a whole paper could be built on that tension in that theme between the dramatic tone of hopelessness and despair, combined with this idea of like rescue and hopefulness. And I think there's a dilemma there if we emphasize hopefulness and positive outcomes and happy endings and so on, then the risk is that we downplay the severity of the problem. But if we only highlight despair and hopelessness, then people will also be passive and not do anything about it, because they would just think that, okay, yeah, it's hopeless, we can't do anything. So there's probably, the journalists are probably fighting with that and trying to find a balance, and we want to say something more about that also. And then finally, I really like the concept of mystification of vulnerability. I mean, I think you should write another paper just on that on that notion. It sounds like the title of a Booker Prize winning novel or something. It's a great formulation, and I think that's just digging into that. Maybe you could like identify different kinds of strategies of mystification. I mean, you already did that in your paper, but you could probably thematize the material and say, okay, so these are the different strategies that journalists use when they mystify vulnerability. And it's so interesting because wildfires, and that's also, I remember reading this Katrina paper in the Stacey Alamo and Hickman, Susan Hickman anthology. Maybe it's the same paper that you referred to. But she argues then that Katrina brought out vulnerabilities and inequalities in society. It highlighted the unequal distribution of resources. And here it's interesting then that, of course, these wildfires also highlight animals' vulnerability, but it's as if the journalists feel an extra responsibility to then mystify that vulnerability. So it's like the more vulnerable animals become, the more work is put into downplaying the structural problems. So I think that concept really captures an extremely interesting tension in this material. So those are my 4 thoughts. I also noted some questions, but maybe this is enough for now to start off with.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you so much, David, for your comments and for your ideas also in discussion and very nice comments about the paper. I hope it's useful. Regarding your first question, why are there so few pieces? Well, I think it's related to the what the news values. So whatever the journalists highlights, then they consider that is worthwhile reporting on. So in the case, if we take, for instance, the case of the 2017 wildfires, there were many human losses and human deaths. And whenever there's a human death, that immediately overcomes all the rest. So this happens, it has to do with the way, from my point of view, and Isabel is here who studied these values for many years, and say if she agrees or not, but from my point of view, it has mostly to do with how journalism is, as a profession, is organized in terms of selecting some things that they believe they sell better than the others. And of course, whenever there are topics that, and this of course is related to the values that Maria was also mentioning, how our social values, and which are anthropocentric and which usually put the human interests in the center. So to go back to the example of 2017, because there were human deaths, all the other losses were secondary. Until then, the news faded away around the human losses and deaths, and then the other actors stepped in as the center of the main. Not really the main, because actually they were being brought to the news because there were losses of the humans as well, but still it was worth mentioning their deaths as well. So I think this would be an explanation, not the explanation, the simple, probably there are many, but this would be my most quick answer to this topic, because these disasters have many threats that are considered worthwhile reporting on before getting to animals in an anthropocentric world and frame of mind, of course.
Yeah, just to chip in, that connects also to the policy paper where politicians protested against grieving animals and grieving nature because it sort of downplays the value of human life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Good point. Exactly. And this tension between hopelessness and help, and so hopelessness on the one hand, and hope. So this tension between despair and the rise of hope. I think it's very interesting. And as you were speaking, I was thinking also about media languages and how, for instance, if you watch a primetime news program from the start to the end, which we seldom do nowadays because we kind of browse through it and jump back and forth. But if we do, you'll see that the news they shift the tone in order to produce an emotional release. So after showing something that is very stressful, that is very helpless, then the news coming afterwards is usually lighter, and sometimes it's even striking us because it's even almost shocking. But after showing deaths in a war zone, they show football and the football club. But this is related to the emotional, the way the news are structured in order to become entertainment, which they are. So news are to inform, but they are mostly entertainment. So when we sit after a full day of work in front of the TV to watch the news, it's our little moment of connecting with the world, of course, knowing what's there, being aware of the main topics, but we are relaxing from a heavy day. So this is part of the media narrative as well. This constant tension between something that is more stressful, produces tension, brings emotion, because the news lives out of this emotion as well, and then a release that creates homeostasis. So brings a balance, an emotional balance. So this would also be like an explanation coming from communication and the media language, which is what we are discussing here. In terms, of course, there are other tensions in terms of the social discourses and political discourses that also reflect themselves here in these tensions. And sometimes what we find is that the narratives about hope and they also mystify. Because whenever, for instance, the pieces of news that brought animals as heroes, as very very positive, or I wouldn't say rose-colored glasses, but there was like this tone which would be more it also mystifies the structural inequalities that lie behind the events that took place and that are being reported. So there's this tension also. So I would put it in these two layers: the media languages themselves, which is, from my point of view, very immediate to relate to this tension, and a deeper level, which has to do with the social discourse and how the social discourse also lives out of this tension, and how, in a way, sometimes the hopeful narratives and the positive narratives help to perpetuate a certain state of things, which perpetuate inequalities and these vulnerabilities to these inequalities. And the thing with the mystification of vulnerability, thank you for your comments. It's interesting to dig into if there are different strategies of this mystification. For now, we've talked about the one that we found was most evident, but maybe there are others. Now that we're going to look deeper into the rest of the data, we can have that into consideration. I would just add that sometimes we also find that this also erases, and that happens also with the discourse of the victimization of animals as victims. So in the popular discourse, for instance, when we talk with animal activists, like animals as victims of disaster would be a good thing, inverted commas. So something, rather than being economic losses, than being victims would be better. But we find that being a victim is not necessarily a good visibility, if we could use the word, because not only they're being victims, vicarious victims, because the humans are victims, but also because their agency is often erased. So it's like they're being deprived of agency through a full victimization, which is also something we should discuss as animal scholars, right? Like, what is the agency? And of course, it differs between species. but I think it's also related with these types of mystification, if it also expands to the animal agency, which we think does. So here it is.
I just wanted to add to the first question about the how so little animals in the news. It's not only about human losses that the news try to cover. It even when there are no human deaths, the focus always goes to the human tragedy. They lost homes, they lost their animals eventually, but animals are just like a reference, a slide reference of the loss of the by the part of the human beings. So it's very rare to see a news that actually talks about the animal as a subject itself. So and in the case of Brazil, we don't see that often mentions to human tragedies, but we talked about we see a lot of the problems about agribusiness, and it identified a lot of political unsatisfaction, and then a lot of critical points of views around the political positions around the wildfires and related to agribusiness. And then here the animals was mostly viewed as a villains, also appearing as a second thought, but always in the center of political discourse. It was always related to it. And even in going back to the Portuguese case, in for example, prime time broadcasting news, we had the moment here in Portugal in 2024, which was when we had the north and center wildfires. We had like 2 or 3 days of TV broadcastings that only talked about wildfires all the time, and human tragedies, but no, animals were almost zero. So it remains always at the center, and the anthropocentric view of the humans and the interest of the audience, basically.
Yeah, because I have a question that I wrote down about animals' resources and like grieving resources, so to speak. I mean, did you ever find any case of a farmer who were like genuinely sad for the animals, talking about like the suffering of the animal? Because I imagine that like in Brazil you have these huge conglomerates, like agricultural conglomerates with really big farms, and there, of course, I mean, as a business person, you don't meet the animals maybe that you make money out of, and so your loss is economic. But then I'm thinking about like small scale farmers who might also empathize with the animals, if that's the way. Did you ever find any examples of that, or yeah?
Totally. Not only in news, but also in interviews that we're doing in the kind of ethnography that we're doing in the north. Definitely. So there's this mix between an economic and emotional relationship with the animals. Cows, sheep, and goats, mostly in that specific zone where we're at. So there's an economic loss, but there's an emotional loss, and there are and they have and we found examples of really. Of course, we know that from literature as well. People put themselves in danger to save the animals very often because sometimes it's interpreted as being because they don't want to lose the economic the animals as economic assets. But that's not only what we found. We found also a deep connection with the animals and grieving. They are also grieved, the animals, the farmed animals in particular cases, and also in the news, right, Sarah? Do you want to say something? Okay.
Yes, it's I would say quite common to see that happen in the Portuguese case. I was also remembering one particularly news piece where there was this couple that had to evacuate its house and go to a shelter. And they tried to bring all their animals with them. They weren't able to do it, but they didn't bring only their dog. They had a duck. They had also a chicken that they brought with them because of their concern. And they were on their interview. They were really concerned about the other animals that they left behind. So there's always this tension around the economic and emotional values.
We have time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience.
Well, I have a question. Congratulations one more time. And if you have in the end of project, you provide documents and materials for stockholders and communities, journalists. It's a question, okay? And also a suggestion, if you rely or link news fellows, info entertainment, and silly season, because it's the time of the fires in Portugal. So 3 main aspects to news fellows.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, definitely. Silly season being like that's the time in the summer where everyone goes and what the news has to be made. There's no football. Also, football is about to begin in August, but then there's this gray area. And it's definitely something to and also the interplays between the political agenda and the economic agenda in the silly season and the news values is very important. If we're planning to build some documents to the stakeholders, yes, there is the initially it was planned to build some what we would call it's the policy. It was mostly we were thinking mostly about the policies. But now that we have all this data, I think it's interesting also to build something which is more practical, right? A document that can be handed out and discussed and used as a tool also by
like a policy brief.
The policy brief, exactly. That was the word I was looking for. But the policy brief is mostly for policies, but in this case, we would include also information about the media. I think it would be interesting, definitely. It would be an output. Thank you.
Any more questions? In that case, we're finishing right on time. So thank you so much to our presenters and thank you for the whole day and all the presentations throughout the day. Thank you.